Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of the Detours in Music podcast. I'm the host here, Laura Ruppel, and I'm super excited about today's episode. Before we get started, though, I do have some updates about the podcast. I know last week I had an update that the podcast had received its first email. This week, something almost more exciting happened. The podcast Instagram received a follow from the Double Read Dish podcast, and I wanted to shout them out because even if that follow back didn't mean much to them, it meant a lot to me because that podcast is part of my inspiration for starting this podcast, and I listen to their episodes every 2 weeks when an oboist is on, and I went to their show at IDRS this past summer and found them to be incredibly inspiring, and it definitely motivates me to work hard on this platform. Another more serious update for all of you is that in the coming 2 weeks, probably, you might notice that not all of my episodes will be on Spotify or Apple Music podcast apps anymore. You can always find archived episodes on the podcast YouTube channel, which is Detours in Music Podcast, and on my website, lauraruppelobo.weebly.com. I will have both of those locations linked in the bio for this episode. All right, let's get started and hear from Dr. Chandler.
I'm Beth Chandler. I'm the flute professor here at JMU.
Awesome. Can you tell us how you got your start in music?
Yes. Well, I feel very fortunate and sort of unusual in that I started playing flute in 6th grade. I grew up in Texas. Texas public schools in, beginning band in 6th grade when basically everybody else started as well.
Yeah.
And I was very committed to playing the flute, but couldn't actually make a sound initially. My mom was a flute player,
okay.
And through kind of into college, didn't major in music or anything, but when I was little, she taught the occasional flute lesson, and so I heard that, and I really admired her, and I guess I was just drawn to the flute because of that, influence and experience. But when it came time for me to choose an instrument, I couldn't make a sound. I was very encouraged, obviously, to consider something that I could actually make a sound on. And I was just very, we'll say determined, stubborn.
That's cool, though, because
Yeah.
I think either it could go like your parent does something so you don't want to do that
true.
thing.
Yeah, true.
Or like in personal experience.
Yes.
Or like I couldn't make a sound on the flute. I still can't.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that's just not for me. But that's...
Well, it's silly that, I remember, we had a summer band kind of process before school started, and I went to, it was a little day camp every day for, I think, a week, and I just couldn't get a sound. It's so silly, but... really, it took 2 weeks. I remember when it happened, I was sitting at the end of my parents' bed and just kind of hanging out in there with them and, kind of just, noodling around trying to, and then it was this eureka moment and I made a sound and, everybody came running from various parts of the house. What was that? But anyway, but after that happened, school started, and really, I don't know, within a few weeks, I just somehow knew that that's what I wanted to do. I remember sitting in 6th grade band and, we were playing, I think we were preparing for, a holiday concert, and we were playing Christmas carols, and, had my first chair test and did well, made first chair, and I liked it. And I don't know, very, very quickly just decided this is what I want to do with my life, which is pretty weird because the typical 6th grader, I don't think, needs to figure that out. But it just sort of came to me, and I just, feel really lucky that awesome. I knew.
Did you have like a lot of experience with music outside of the band program, or was that?
Yes. So, and that, I think that's a great question because I think for me, my mom, she would sort of deny that her flute influence was significant, but beyond that, both my parents were really avid music lovers, all sorts of music, and so growing up, we listened to a lot of classical music in my house, and my dad actually was really into bluegrass and folk music, and and then they liked other things too, rock and various things, and so we had a lot of different kinds of musical experiences, went to a lot of concerts, music festivals, and things like that. So that was very, very big sort of presence in my childhood. And then once I started playing flute, then my parents were really great about. They always were season ticket holders to the Austin Symphony, and we went to opera and a lot of different things. And so they really helped to cultivate that. So I feel really lucky that I was exposed to a lot of that. And also NPR radio actually was a really big thing because it was always on. And in those days, they would send out the monthly guide, like a paper booklet about what they were going to play when.
That's smart.
And so, my mom and I would, drive around town and we'd either guess what was on the radio or we'd be able to look at. So I learned a lot of music that way, which is pretty fun.
I know when I was little with kind of the same thing, I'd be like, oh, what instrument's that?
Exactly.
You learn like through what's on the radio.
It's great.
What composer do you think?
Yeah, exactly.
I still get that wrong.
Yes,
but
me too sometimes. Yes.
I guess going into high school, what were your decisions with like flute performance or like what schools?
So again, since I kind of knew in 6th grade, it was just always sort of a beeline path for, this is what I'm going to do. I really never wavered from that goal and knew that I wanted to major in music, and pretty much all along knew that I was going to be a performance major. I grew up in Austin. There's a wonderful university there, but, a lot of kids don't want to stay exactly at home, although now I see the benefit, and I think that you have gotten to experience just that one. And now with my own kids, I think, oh, it's so wonderful.
Don't move.
Exactly. But for me, also, in high school, it was an extremely, a really wonderful band program, but also very competitive environment. And so I think I just wanted kind of a new scene, and so but I was pretty sure that I wanted to go relatively close to home because I was close to my family. I think, looking back, I think I did send some recorded auditions to some faraway schools like Indiana, I think, but I kind of always knew that I was going to stay in Texas. But I ended up going only 100 miles away to Baylor University, and it was just far enough that, felt like I really did have a very new experience, but it was close enough that I could get home when I needed to. My parents came up for a lot of concerts, which was great. And ultimately, the reason I chose Baylor really was just by and large because of the flute teacher there, who became a great mentor to me. And she was kind of what directed me there.
I guess moving forward you also went to Cincinnati after Baylor.
Yes.
What was that transition?
Yeah, so basically, after I graduated from Baylor, I was really lucky, got to spend a year in England on a Fulbright grant. Yes, living in this tiny village with this wonderful renowned teacher named Trevor Y. And the experience of just being so focused on flute was really wonderful. But beyond that, just the experience at that point of living in another country and being supported by the Fulbright program, which was so generous, and got to meet all sorts of wonderful, smart people, who were very focused in their own disciplines. Did that for a year, and then did my master's at New England Conservatory in Boston. Okay. And so making that transition from Waco, Texas, where Baylor was, to then this tiny village in England to Boston, by far the biggest city I'd ever lived in, was a pretty big shock. But I ended up loving that and mostly appreciating just all the wonderful cultural things that a big city, has. And then after my master's, moved to Cincinnati to do my DMA. And that transition was also significant, mostly because Cincinnati is a great city, but it was smaller than Boston. And so, it felt almost like I was going to a town, comparatively.
Was the competitiveness in your high school band program, was that something that you were intentionally not seeking in future schools?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So it was interesting. My high school band was amazing. I think we had about 200 kids there were probably 3 concert bands, if I'm remembering that correctly, and a lot of really good flute players, and some of those some of those other flutists are still, one in particular is still a really close friend of mine who happens to teach at another college in Virginia, which is crazy how those things kind of, come full circle. But, it was a very intense experience, and Baylor was also very competitive, but in a different, just a very different sort of character and atmosphere, just by way of, suddenly you're a music major with other, people who were really good in their own high school programs, and now you're all together and you're kind of, trying to work your way up through the system, so to speak, and so then going to Trevor Wise' studio in England was very intense, because that was, several hours a day of all classes were taught, all lessons actually were taught in a group setting. Okay. So there were 6 students there from all over the world, in this tiny village, and it was just all the flute pretty much all the time. And that was a really good contrast, because I had been very focused as an undergraduate, but of course going to a liberal arts university, as you're still balancing your other coursework and all that. So England kind of allowed that kind of focus. And so then when I went to NEC in particular, both NEC and CCM as conservatories, those were completely unique experiences to me, coming from a university and then this other unique thing in England, and then being in kind of a big time kind of high powered conservatory setting. I think in both of those contexts, my teachers in each of those schools were really good to foster a pretty healthy environment within the studio, but there was certainly some competition, and some of there were some tough situations where we kind of had to work through that. I felt because I knew, especially of course by the time I went to CCM, I really knew that I wanted to be a college teacher myself, and so I think a lot of those different kinds of studio experiences really helped to influence where I ultimately wanted to lead my own students in terms of fostering healthy competition, but having it be a good healthy environment, but also helping students to kind of find their own way and help each other to improve, and help to push each other.
What do you think's like the biggest thing that you learned in a studio that you try to bring to your studio here?
Well, particularly I would say at CCM, the flute studio there was wonderful. Many great players, almost all of whom are still really close friends, and most of whom are working as professional flutists now. And I think we just really challenged each other, but were very supportive of each other. And to have that kind of high level of playing by people who were really nice people, who we all really cared about each other. I think that probably was the strongest influence for me. And in just wanting to have my students be friends as much as possible. And I tell them, you don't have to be best friends, but you definitely have to be able to get along well enough. And, you're all going to be in a position to help support each other, certainly in the early stages of your careers. So it's important to, of course, to be nice, but it's amazing because many of them do end up becoming really, really close friends,
One thing I've noticed in my time here with your studio is that everyone is at everyone's stuff.
Yes, they do. Yes,
it's like you.
Yes, and then a lot of that is me making them do it. But I really hope
it does have an impact, and it even shows. I think, like I've noticed as a member of another studio who tries to do that. But, it does say something about the studio.
Well, that's good that you've recognized that. I mean, I would like to think that they would just go anyway, and they mostly would, but. There are some times, right. I mean, there's some times that are just really, really busy, and they, they're really good about, if somebody has a very specific reason they have to miss something like a grad school audition, which has happened recently, of course that happens and everybody understands, but they're all really good about, sharing recordings and videos of their performances. And I think I hope they want feedback, positive feedback, from each other. And they also, I think, learn a lot too. And I think they're pretty good critiquers when it comes to, being able to give good feedback, but also feedback that will help them to improve. Yeah.
I guess on a different direction.
Yeah.
You knew when you were in 6th grade you wanted to play the flute. Was there ever anything else that you considered?
Yeah. It's funny. Well, by the time I got to high school, I guess beginning in middle school, I started taking French. And so I was I loved that. And then went through, all 4 years in high school of French. And so, I guess at that point it basically had 5 years of French. And so I often would think, well, if I didn't do music, maybe I would be a French major. What I would have done with that, I have no idea.
Yep, maybe
no. I mean, in particular, I loved the idea of travel, and thought, okay, well, maybe I would be an interpreter or whatever. I mean, of course, now I recognize there's so many things you can do with, being fluent in another language, and I don't know that I was fully fluent at that point, but yeah, that was probably the second interest. And then I really loved English literature in particular, and, often thought about that too, that, maybe I'd be an English major or something. Instead, I just married one. He was an English major, but doesn't use it at all now. Yeah. But other than being a good writer and communicator, they're good skills to be had by that. But.
A couple people in their interviews have mentioned something that they would be interested in doing outside of music now.
Yes.
Do you have anything?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Because it's funny, because when I was, a kid, and then in school, it was hard. I was so laser focused that I didn't really give much credence to another possibility. Other than, I guess, one of my dreams was to be a ballerina.
Yes, I had that dream too.
But, too tall, wrong body type, blah, blah, blah. Maybe there would be hope now, because, it's much more open-minded field now. But didn't really have any serious designs on that or anything else. Yeah. But now, I'm very intrigued by being a baker. Okay. I like to cook. I don't have that much time to do it. I particularly like to bake, and during the school year don't get much time to do that. But I sort of dream about being a pastry chef, or opening my own bakery or cafe or whatever. But that's a lot of hard work, and not that I am seriously considering it, but switching from music, where many of your activities are in the evenings and on weekends. I mean, being a baker, that does not help that situation.
Yeah.
You're up really early, and especially if you're working in a restaurant, that's crazy hours.
Fun, so have flute players in the background.
That's right. Yes.
Flutes only bakery.
That's right.
What is something that you struggle with, particularly in your undergraduate degree, or maybe if that changed over time?
I think I talk to my students about this from time to time. I think particularly as an undergrad, I think I spent a lot of time being fearful of, what if my dreams don't come true? Like, what happens if I can't get a job in this field? Because I was so focused on performance, and knew that, and performance to me pretty early on meant making a career out of, performing, college teaching, all of this. And so I definitely expended a lot of energy just being worried that it just wouldn't happen. But I also think deep down, somehow I knew that I was just going to keep plugging away and work really hard, and I was so focused, and I knew that things were going to be okay. Whatever, I couldn't really necessarily define that, and then, moving into grad school, where the stakes become higher, because you're making much more significant investment in time and energy and money, and, living in a city, all those kinds of things. Those fears became more acute, because you're also starting to get closer to the end of, that process, as and, you're thinking, wow, in a few short years, this is, I need to be doing whatever, that career looks like. I would say a big detour was actually in my master's degree. I developed an elbow injury that required me to stop playing altogether, and eventually ended up with a major elbow surgery. And at the time, it was a total derailment.
Yeah.
And this was in the second year of my master's. Actually, the way the whole situation developed was, well, now I can look back and I guess I can call it interesting, but this was while I was at New England Conservatory, and we were playing Mahler's Ninth Symphony with Gunther Schuller, who's now deceased, but he's considered a Mahler expert and was a master horn player and conductor.
I'm playing a piece arranged by him right
now.
now.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, just incredible musician, and he had been on NEC's faculty and had helped develop their jazz program there. I mean, he was just a complete musician, and but very intense and also very intimidating. And I was assigned to play principal on Mahler 9 with him conducting. They had brought him back for, I think it was a special birthday celebration for him. Anyway, through that process, I started to have pain. And anyway, fast forward, this was in the fall of, I guess, the second year of my master's. And I thought, okay, well, I had heard about tendonitis, thought that was kind of where it was going. And it was manifesting itself as that. But as I was really lucky to be in Boston, where there are many wonderful, doctors and specialists. And so along that pathway and kind of looking for sort of the bigger cause of those issues, which was a pretty short time frame. It was over the course of just a matter of months. But learned that I had this nerve compression in my elbow, and it's called an ulnar nerve compression. And I did some what was considered at the time very conservative treatment in terms of rest, physical therapy, ultrasound therapy, a lot of different kinds of things. But within a few months and then trying to play again, the condition wasn't significantly better, and so that resulted in seeing more specialists, and then being led in the direction of surgery, which was very terrifying at that time because I was young, my career hadn't launched at that point, but I had invested a lot in being at NEC, and just I didn't know how things were going to turn out. And I was also given the option of, I could have taken an additional year off and just seen how things played out. In fact, when I got a second opinion by another very well-known doctor who treats musicians, at that time it just didn't seem to make sense to wait it out for another year with sort of the gut feeling that I was going to be right back where I was, but just a year would have elapsed, and I would have spent a lot of money staying in Boston and all that. So I proceeded with the surgery, and even going into the surgery, of course, you sign all these waivers, and one of them was the very real possibility that the nerve could be severed, and if that were the case, I really didn't know if I was going to play again. But fortunately that didn't happen, and the surgery went well, and it was a very long road to recovery. I think I was allowed to start playing again maybe 6 weeks after the surgery, but was only allowed to play a minute a day, so I had to use a timer. Wow. And then over the course of really several months, I was able to very gradually increase time. So, a minute a day for, I don't know, probably a week, then adding on another minute, working up incrementally. Yeah. And it was excruciating, not just from a physical pain standpoint, but just mentally and emotionally. It's really,
this is not the time.
Yes, no, not at all. And just and even before the surgery, being told that I really couldn't, I couldn't play. I had to rest, and I had several high profile performances that were scheduled that I had to cancel. And I remember telling my doctor, in fact, one of them was my teacher at NEC, Paula Robeson, who is wonderfully a world-renowned flutist, and I was scheduled to play Vivaldi Concerti with her at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and at the Temple of Dendur, and I told my doctor, well, no, this is happening. So and he said, well, it's not happening, and I was just in total denial. And he said, no, you have to cancel those things. And at the time, I just remember it was devastating, and thinking I'm never going to have experiences like these again. Now, in retrospect, of course, ultimately I had many other wonderful experiences, but they had told me, in that process that it probably was going to be a solid 18 months before I felt like I was playing at the level that I had been playing at before I started having problems, and
that's a long time.
It was a long 18 months, yeah. But in that time, amazingly, I had taken off, a lot of playing, but was able to finish a lot of my coursework at NEC, and then delayed my final recital for about 6 months, and then was finally able to complete that. And miraculously, in the midst of that, was able to be accepted to the DMA program at CCM. And I had known the teacher previously, and so I think he took a risk on, he knew my playing before all of that happened, but I think he took a risk in not knowing if I was going to fully recover.
Yeah.
But it was really like to the week, 18 months later, and it was a noticeable experience that, wow, I actually feel like I'm making progress in my playing now. It just, coming back from that it was a long road, and I definitely, there were a lot of doubts in the midst of that, I'm not sure where this is going to go. And a big part of that too, at that time, particularly musicians, there were not a lot of musicians who were admitting that they had physical problems, because there really was a stigma associated with that. I'm so glad that I sought, treatment and help when I needed to. And a lot of my peers at NEC at the time, I feel like I kind of helped to open some doors for other people to come forward and say, oh, I've had this pain forever. Oh, yeah, my thumb doesn't function the way it should. And other people were able to get some treatment too. And now my doctor, my neurologist in Boston actually now has a performing arts clinic at NEC, and he goes and sees students as patients on Saturdays. And I think he's pretty busy because a lot of them have problems. And now it's thankfully it's a climate that's much more open-minded and willing to examine some of these issues and why they're happening, and that treatment is a good thing, and that it doesn't make you less of a musician if you're dealing with physical injury.
One question I would have is, was that injury definitely something like, not to say you caused, but like
flute related?
By,
yes. So that particular injury, I think it was related to what I would say now overuse, or maybe not being not being as mindful about postural things, and also just the nature of holding the flute. The issue was primarily in my left elbow, but I also had it in my right elbow too. But it's not that surprising to know that a lot of flutists have, that's a common, common as far as injuries go, for flutists to have it in their left arm, mostly because of the flexion that your left elbow has to be, the position it has to be in when you're holding the flute.
For a long time.
Yes, exactly. And so, you're constantly tugging on that nerve. And the way they described it to me is that probably my nerve is maybe a little more superficial, or a little closer to the surface of my elbow, or of my skin, basically. So if I hadn't played the flute, maybe the issue would have impacted things like typing, but in the grand scheme of things, I probably wouldn't have had to have, pursued.
Typed that many
yes,
times.
yes, yeah, and like really pursued that kind of treatment. But because I wanted to be a flutist, it looked certainly at the time like there was not really another option. And I also felt good about the process because the neurologist who diagnosed it and who was kind of doing my treatment, but wasn't the actual surgeon, he was a pianist himself. He was married to a flutist, and he had the same procedure on both of his elbows as a pianist, just as a hobbyist pianist. I think he played at quite a high level, but the fact that he did that not for his vocation, and helped to develop the surgery, and was a real pioneer with that. So I felt like I was in really good hands, and knew that I was probably going to, come out of it as well as I could, being in that context. So, yeah.
I remember my senior year of high school, they're like, you need to get your wisdom teeth out. Oh. And I don't know why we did this, but I did that like 2 weeks before my first audition.
Oh, no.
And I remember sitting there and he's like, so, like, it could, they tell you what could happen, and I'm not usually someone to, like, question anything.
Yes, yeah.
But I remember being like, so, like, could you not cut the nerve?
Yeah,
is that something we can talk about? And I
don't.
remember asking, like, why would it happen? And he's like, oh, it's just the tooth is there in the way, or it's not. And I'm like,
yeah.
So this isn't something I can, like, really beg.
Yeah, exactly.
And I was very happy when I could feel my life.
Yes, that's what a relief.
I'm supposed to have an audition.
Oh my goodness.
Probably just a bad idea.
That's tough. But look at you.
Yes,
it all worked out.
I think it worked out. During that kind of 18 months for you, were you said you were doing coursework, but was there ever a point where you were thinking this might not heal the way I want it to?
Yeah, I mean, so really the whole ordeal was probably about 2 years because of the time before the surgery where I wasn't playing, and I was just, I was, filling my other requirements. But, I did definitely wonder, because I thought, especially in relation to the degree, I had completed all requirements except the last recital, and had to, of course, get special permission to delay lessons to prepare for the recital. And I was just lucky that people were, particularly the faculty, were so supportive and just helped me to make that happen. But even in that process, I wasn't sure if I was, I think the recital that I finally played was good, but I was still very much in recovery mode because it was probably about 9 months after the surgery. And so, I wasn't able to practice, by that point I was maybe up to 2 hours a day, but, for a master's student at a conservatory, that was not the expectation. That was not what I didn't feel that it was sufficient, but it was all I could do, without really overtaxing my body. And so, and I didn't know, even if I felt like I was playing well, I just didn't know where that would lead, and if it would somehow, and if it would come back, and I think, now I'm about 24 years past that surgery now, but I just had to build in, have a completely new approach to how I practiced and how I could be very efficient with my physical movements, and changed my posture to some extent, and for since then I've been just very cognizant of certain things in my life that I just can't take on, for fear, because there is still soreness there, scar tissue and that kind of thing, and I just know that any kind of lack of thoughtful practice and preparation impacts that. And I don't think I'm going to go back to where I was, but still, there have been certainly a number of times through the years where I've thought, gosh, am I having weakness? What's happening? I feel some pain, and so I just have to constantly manage it. And I do things daily to prevent that, but I'm not conscious of it anymore, because it's just become habit.
A lot of people so far on the podcast who are not studio professors, it's something similar where they suffered an injury. Or even just kind of had anxiety about developing an injury, and then that kind of led to their eventual interest in another
something
field.
else. It totally makes sense. I mean, because it's, and there is, I think about that, like what you have to maintain, or what kind of condition your body has to be in to keep playing. And I think about that before every big performance. Wow, if I had some major injury right now, or even just illness, thinking about, I have to stay well because, I have this big performance, and what would happen? I mean, the show does go on, but, but the ripple effect of, if you were suddenly out of the loop, and weren't able to fulfill your obligation, it does wreak havoc on a lot of things. So that kind of pressure is tough. I mean, that happens in a lot of different arenas, different disciplines too. But, the fact that we as instrumentalists, what we're doing is very physical, and just have to make sure that we can keep doing that,
What's some advice that you hear yourself giving a lot to undergraduate students?
Wow.
And I know this can be very broad.
I mean, I give a lot of advice. Probably some of it my students don't want to hear. I think one thing that I find myself saying more frequently, recently, our culture is so different than it was when I was a student. And so, I was telling one of my students recently, we were talking about scheduling grad school auditions, for instance, and how I had to make all of those arrangements with this was before email, nobody had a cell phone. I think we actually faxed things, we made a lot of phone calls, just a completely different culture. And it's interesting to think about how studying music, and particularly learning an instrument, and developing, into, playing at a very high level of proficiency, that those things have not changed. I mean, the instruments themselves are basically the same instruments. I mean, the flute, in my case, is basically the same designed instrument as in the 1860s. And so, so we're playing the same thing, and so we develop our skills in basically the same way. Yet our culture is so different that our attention spans are different. We are so much more easily distracted by by the minute. And so I think instrumental study is the same, and yet our culture is not the same. And so how do I help my students who, that's all they know is this world now that's very different than the world I knew when I was their age, studying and preparing. How do I help them to, prepare and do what's necessary, to follow that same path that I had to follow? And it's really tough. I mean, there are a lot of things in our society that don't require us to be patient in many ways, in as many ways as maybe in the past. And so, and yet, developing into a great musician requires that kind of patience. Yes, it does. And just time and, thoughtful work, and there are no shortcuts to that. And that's sometimes hard for all of us to accept, that, wow, we can do all these other things instantaneously, and yet becoming a better musician is still just going to take, it's an evolutionary process. So I talk a lot about that, I think, with my students. And another thing that we talk about is kind of related to that, I guess, is just staying focused. And and especially, with social media, it's so easy to be distracted by, oh, well, so-and-so's doing this, I'm not doing this, and so-and-so, everybody's posting videos of their, warm-ups or whatever every day, and you think, okay, that's great. But, it doesn't, that's not a testimony about you and what you're doing, and so I find myself, particularly with grad students, helping because they're that much closer to sort of being out in the world, and it's sort of a continuous process of helping them to just stay focused on what do you need to do, what path are you following, and how can you just stay focused on who you are and not be distracted by who everybody else is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Would you say that your injury was your biggest musical detour, or have there been others?
So it was definitely a huge one, and certainly for that period in my life, pre-professional and then early professional. Yes, definitely. I would say the other big detour that wasn't actually a detour but could have been a detour. About almost 4 years ago now, I had a cardiac experience in the middle of a performance.
I remember hearing
yes, and it was very dramatic. It's a very rare condition called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. It's also known as broken heart syndrome. And the experience is it mimics a heart attack. The symptoms are the same as a heart attack. The recovery is the same. The major difference is that there are no blockages. I was a very healthy person and didn't have any risk factors, and the condition is really brought on by stress. And it had been a pretty intense couple of years leading up to that. I had finished a term as National Flute Association president. That was a very an experience that I really felt honored to get to have. I mean, it was a real privilege, but it was very intense as well, especially in, maintaining my full-time job and raising a family and, a number of other things that had kind of happened in our lives that just sort of culminated in a pretty intense, prolonged, stressful period. And so when I played this recital, I mean, I won't go into the details, but basically I knew something was wrong. And anyway, fast forward a few days later and, ended up with this diagnosis. In thinking back, I did a lot of processing about, why would that have happened in the middle of a recital? I played so many performances before, it wasn't a particularly, over-the-top challenging program. It was kind of just a standard, like I play recitals all the time, But I think what they think happens in this condition is that stress hormones sort of overtake the heart and kind of stun it into the point of it not functioning properly, and takes many months to heal. And so what they think happened is, after this prolonged period of pretty intense stress, that in that moment, this surge of adrenaline and cortisol and all those things that happen when you're kind of in performance, which mostly can be really used to your advantage. They kind of they were sort of the last straw that just kind of made my heart just kind of say, nope, stop. And so in the months that followed, I really had to really analyze how did I get to that point, because it wasn't just when people have a heart attack, they not always, but often they can point to very specific risk factors. Lifestyle yes. And and because this, I didn't actually have any kind of physiological any kind of blockage or anything, I was healthy, and so I really had to sort of analyze how can I gain better control of, stress management, and how, and the fact that it happened in a recital, was that telling me something bigger? And what I really came to learn, I think the term broken heart syndrome is kind of a misnomer, and a lot of people that it's a pretty rare condition, but a lot of people that have experienced it don't like that condition or don't like that terminology, because it kind of it in the medical community in some circles, it hasn't been given a lot of credence in terms of the seriousness of the condition. But and it's also just very sad. It's very sad, And
like, you don't like the flute?
Yes, exactly. and so I really had to analyze that. And I remember just in talking to medical professionals, in the recovery process, one woman in particular was able to identify, as I was kind of telling her about the process leading up to that experience, she said, it makes sense to me that you had a broken heart, because in that moment, I'm very passionate about performing and I love it, but I remember that recital was in April. It was at the end of a very intense year. And, it was like there was some element of me that was probably sort of going through the motions. And I think I lost track a little bit of, of why I love to do what I love to do. And so, in the immediate months that followed that, of course, I spent a lot of time thinking, why did this happen? But now, several years out, I really do have a very different perspective on the fact that I really think that happened for me and not to me, and that it allowed me to kind of realign with my most the most precious things in my life, and my top priorities, which includes how I make music and what I really love about it. And it certainly has taught me to be able to say no to a lot of things that I never realized.
You still do a
yes,
lot.
I do. I do.
You're everywhere.
Yes. But it's good because I feel like it happened at a point in my career where I can say no to things that I don't really want to do, or that I feel like I'm not going to, be able to be as present or, committed to, and can really prioritize the things that I really love to do. And I think that my performing since then, it was a long recovery. I mean, I didn't perform any kind of solo thing for almost a year after that, mostly because I really physically was just, still had major shortness of breath and just things that were making playing difficult. But I knew that would subside eventually. And I think that I feel like it has sort of renewed my spirit and vigor and, real passion for playing and just being grateful to be able to do what I do every day. There are many days where I really am kind of overcome with the fact that, this is incredible that I get to spend my days making music, teaching people about music, sharing music with other people. And of course, that's why we do it. But it's really easy when you're in the daily grind to kind of lose track of that a little bit.
Well, I know that my mom especially loves your performance.
She is like the best fan in Harrisonburg. She's so wonderful.
So you're definitely emoting the love for music
I
very
appreciate
clearly.
that. That's trying to do that. And
it's this isn't hard. This is easy. My elbow doesn't hurt.
So that's right. All those things seem to not matter. At least you want them to not seem like they matter in the moment. Brahms, study Bach, there you will find everything. I have to agree with that in large part, just as, certainly as a flutist, Bach wrote so brilliantly for the flute, but I often sometimes wonder, not that it's too late, but I wonder if I sort of missed my calling and maybe that I should have been a Baroque flutist or something, because I love that repertoire so much and just feel a very deep connection to that. And I think that what has evolved in music in the last 300 plus years. I mean, so much of what Bach put on the page is just been so directly sort of translated to modern language, and we couldn't live without him.
I've never played actually on a Baroque oboe, but in gigs playing Bach or even Mozart, I feel like the most connected to my instrument. So I'm like, this just sits so well, and like
so well.
It sounds beautiful, and like I almost feel like the instruments, like the music from Baroque and classical music, it's like, wow, this is how it's supposed to sound. And like, this is how you're supposed to write for an oboe and for flute.
That's very cool that you have that awareness, because because I mean, there's so much great music to play, but I just think that that body of repertoire is just, for our instruments especially, I mean, it's like that's where the heart and soul, came from. And there's great stuff afterwards, but you can't dismiss that,
And I understand people thinking, oh, it's boring. But when because even listening, I probably feel that way sometimes. But when you're playing it feels different.
Yeah, because it just feels like it just flows. And
definitely.
And I love teaching students Bach, because more often than not, they're very reluctant to, because it feels old. It feels, antiquated and maybe not. And like, it's maybe not so relevant. And so if I can help to change a student's perspective on that, I think is pretty satisfying. And the only other one that I felt like I could sort of connect to, so Bernstein's "To achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time." I feel like that resonates with me so well, because I feel like I work pretty well under pressure, even though as I get older, I'm more annoyed by the pressure. I'm less tolerant of it, but I do good work when, if I have a deadline or, this performance is happening, it's got to happen now. And I think some brilliant things can come from just, having having to sort of batten down the hatches and just dig in and get it done in the moment of, So this is my 19th year at JMU, which is incredible. And I remember when you were a 2-year-old and your dad and I were preparing for recital, and you were running around the coffee table, and you were just so sweet and cute. And so 19 years here, it's incredible, because I think so I'm so fortunate. I was at the University of Florida for just a year before I came to JMU, but I was just so fortunate that I was able to get a tenure track position early on, and was very grateful for that. But when I came to when we moved to Harrisonburg at the time, Harrisonburg was a very different place.
Not what it is
now. And it was the smallest place either my husband or I had ever lived, and we thought, oh, well, there's a quaintness to it, but I don't know.
We're
going to have
people.
to. Yes. And I think we both just continue to be very pleasantly surprised at how much we have grown attached to this community. And JMU is just a wonderful place to be. And, I always felt good about the musical collaborations that happen here, but I just have developed so much greater an appreciation for just the whole university community and our community at large, you know, in Harrisonburg and Rockingham. And it's something that I think has been very unexpected. And recently, we were considering a potential opportunity to go elsewhere, and it was just a very painstaking process because we couldn't envision leaving. More so even than being in a different place. It was that we just couldn't envision not being here. So, and then to see, the School of Music has just evolved in ways that, we would have never, that I certainly wouldn't have expected when I first started. And that's very exciting. So I just, have just grown to be very content in the best way, not in a, kind of lazy, it's fine, but really being deeply musically satisfied. And certainly there are things that, everybody has desires for, I wish this were different, or, but most of those things I find can be solved for in other contexts, and
or it'll be changed.
Or it'll be changed. Exactly. And I mean the two best things, of course, are getting to work with wonderful colleagues who are supportive, but also getting to work with intelligent students, and that has just been, continues to be a great joy. So I'm amazed that it's 19 years in, but I'm really happy it has been that long.
Me too.
This is an awesome project.
Thank
I
you.
think it's wonderful that you're doing this, and I can't wait to hear all of the other episodes. And I'm sure that I'll be learning things about colleagues that I think I know, but I think it's just a wonderful thing to share with, particularly with students, just to so that they can hear, that it's not always a straight path, or even if you feel like you're on a straight trajectory and everything's going well, something will detour, and you just will have to work your way through that. And that's what makes you resilient and strong in the end. Pretty critical for musician life.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all again for listening, and support the podcast by following us on Instagram, Detours in Music Podcast, subscribing on YouTube, Detours in Music Podcast, on Apple Podcast app, rate or comment or subscribe to the podcast. And on Spotify, you can subscribe. We need all the love we can get here on the podcast. But thank you all, and our next interview will be with Dr. Paulo Steinberg.